The ER was unusually quiet for a Thursday evening, with the hum of overhead lights and the occasional beep of monitors the only sounds cutting through the stillness. Nurse Claire Devon moved through the ward with practiced grace, her ponytail loose against her neck, her scrubs wrinkled from a 12-hour shift that should have ended 2 hours ago. She didn't mind staying. It wasn't uncommon for her to linger after hours, especially when someone slipped in through the doors needing care at the last minute. That was how she met him. He stumbled into the just past 9, a dark smear of dried blood down one arm and a deep gash at his temple. His boots were caked with mud, and the scent of pine and diesel trailed behind him like a shadow. One of the front desk nurses called for a wheelchair, but he waved it off with a rough shake of his head. "I'm fine," he said, "just need it cleaned, don't want stitches if I can help it." Claire turned toward the sound of his voice. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a worn flannel shirt, his jaw unshaven and nicked. His eyes were steel gray, direct, and surprisingly soft despite the strain at the edges. She glanced at the gash again. It was long and angry just under his hairline. Definitely needed stitches. "You'll need more than gauze and good intentions," she said, her voice calm but firm. He tried to offer a lopsided grin. "Thought I might find someone who'd take pity on a stubborn man." "You found the wrong nurse for that," she replied, setting down her clipboard. He didn't argue when she guided him gently toward an exam room. His name was Jack Hayes, and he said it like someone used to keeping things to himself. His chart was mostly empty except for a tetanus booster 2 years back and a note from a ski lodge in Montana. Claire didn't press. She learned long ago that some stories surfaced when they were ready. "Let me guess," she said, snapping on gloves as she pulled supplies from the cabinet. "Chainsaw accident, wrestling a bear, attempted carpentry after a few drinks." "Plain maintenance," he replied, eyes flicking up to her. "Took a wrong step off the wing, hit a rock." She paused. "You're a pilot." "Mostly search and rescue, I do my own repairs." Claire's hand stilled for a moment before continuing. "Well, let's make sure the guy saving lives doesn't bleed out from a stupid fall." Jack chuckled but winced as she began cleaning the wound. The antiseptic stung, and she caught the way he clenched his jaw, trying not to flinch. There was a kind of dignity in the way he bore pain, quiet, unshowy. She'd seen it before in soldiers and wildland firefighters, the kind of people who didn't ask for help unless they had no choice. "You should have come in sooner," she said, dabbing at the dried blood with a soaked pad. "I didn't want to miss the call. We had a kid go missing near the ridge, found him before sundown. I came here right after." Claire nodded slowly. "Still, you waited too long, this could have gotten infected." Jack glanced away. "I don't do hospitals." That, she thought, was obvious. Everything about him was built for open skies and distance. He looked out of place under fluorescent light, his body too restless for the confines of walls, but he sat still for her, eyes flicking to her face every time her hands moved close. By the time she finished stitching him up, 6 neat sutures across his brow, he'd gone quiet. Not in a brooding way, more like someone letting the moment settle. "You didn't have to stay late for me," he said as she cleaned the last of the blood from his temple. "I did," she replied. "I wanted to." Their eyes met for a heartbeat too long. Then he looked down, the muscles in his forearm twitching under the scrub of gauze. "Thanks," he said. She helped him sit up, and he tested his balance before pulling his jacket back over his shoulders. There was something reluctant in his movements, as if he wasn't quite ready to leave. Claire watched him, sensing it but not pushing. Some things took time. "Be careful out there, Jack." He turned back at the door. "You too, Nurse Claire." Then he was gone. She found herself watching the door for a long minute after, heart stirring in that slow, unexpected way it did when something important had just happened, and she wasn't sure yet what it meant. It rained the next evening. Claire stood by the break room window, sipping lukewarm coffee as water streaked the glass in thin, silver trails. The hospital was busier tonight. 2 car accidents, a fractured wrist from a fall on slippery pavement, and a toddler with a fever that wouldn't break. She moved through it all with her usual calm, a steady rhythm to her steps, but beneath it there was something quieter stirring. She caught herself glancing at the entrance more often than she cared to admit. He didn't come back, and she hadn't expected him to. Still, something about that encounter had stayed with her, not just the way he'd looked at her with quiet gratitude, but the feeling she'd had while cleaning his wound. Like something important had passed between them in the silence. A few days went by. Claire didn't mention him to anyone, not to Margot, her closest friend in the ER, who would have raised an eyebrow and teased her gently. Not to the night shift nurses who sometimes shared a bottle of wine after work. It was hers, that memory, tucked away like a letter she wasn't ready to open. The following Friday, she took the long road home. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and for once she rolled the windows down. Her mind drifted as the tires hummed against the pavement. She passed the open fields just past the old train crossing and almost didn't notice the low shape rising above the trees. A helicopter. It hovered for a moment before angling down toward the clearing near the fire station. She slowed instinctively. It wasn't unusual out here, not with the mountains so close and search and rescue operating almost daily during hiking season. But as she drove past, she caught a flash of red and white on the side. Hayes Aviation. Her breath caught. That night she looked it up. It took only a few clicks to find a grainy news article about Jack Hayes, former Army pilot turned private contractor known for search and rescue ops in the Rockies. There was a photo. He looked the same, serious, tired, hands in his pockets, a thin scar visible just above his right brow. She stared at the screen for a long time. The next morning she was called in early. A hiker had gone missing up near Angels Point, and the local authorities had requested standby emergency personnel in case of injuries. Claire was assigned to the outdoor medical tent, standard protocol. She packed quickly and drove up toward the ridge, the mountains looming blue and sharp against the pale dawn. When she arrived, the search team was already dispersing into the woods. Radios crackled, dogs barked in short bursts, and the air was charged with that particular tension Claire knew well. Everyone moved with purpose. She set up the supplies and checked in with command. A little after noon, the sound of a helicopter filled the sky. She stepped outside the tent as it descended, blades stirring the dust into clouds. Her heart thudded in her chest, not because she expected him exactly, but because some part of her hoped. He stepped out of the cockpit, helmet under one arm. Jack. He spotted her almost immediately. There was no dramatic pause, no sudden music swelling behind them, just a simple, unspoken recognition. He walked toward her, and something about his expression, half surprised, half sure, made her breath hitch. You again, he said, stopping just in front of her. You again, she returned, keeping her voice even. Didn't expect to see you out here. I work wherever I'm needed. His gaze lingered, guess I shouldn't be surprised. She shrugged, trying not to smile. You all right, didn't fall off the helicopter this time. Jack huffed a quiet laugh, no falling, not today. A call came in then, someone had been found. Claire turned, her body already in motion, but he touched her arm lightly before she moved away. Talk later, he asked. She nodded, yeah, later. The afternoon passed in a blur. She treated a sprained ankle, a dehydration case, and a young man with a broken collarbone. It wasn't until the sun was starting to drop behind the hills that she saw him again. Jack stood by the edge of the tree line, helmet now resting on the tailgate of his truck. He looked at her like he had something to say but wasn't sure where to begin. I owe you, he said when she approached. Claire raised an eyebrow. For what? For that night at the ER, and for not laughing when I winced like a kid. She smirked. You held it together pretty well. He leaned back slightly against the truck, arms crossed. I've been thinking about it. She tilted her head. About your stitches. Know about you that night. Her smile faded a little, not in discomfort, but in understanding. Jack's voice was low. I don't really stop. I move, fly, fix things, save people. But after I left, I kept thinking about how you stayed. You didn't have to, but you did. Claire looked down for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. It's my job, she said softly, but it wasn't just that. Jack's eyes searched hers. Can I see you again? The question wasn't smooth or rehearsed. It was raw in a way that made it impossible to doubt. She nodded. All right, you can. Jack exhaled as if he hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. The wind picked up slightly, stirring her hair. The last of the light fell across the field in long golden slants. He didn't reach for her hand, didn't push closer. He just stood beside her in the stillness, and she felt something shift, like the beginning of a season. Neither of them said another word. There was no need. The first time Jack showed up at the hospital without an injury, he brought coffee. Claire was charting at the nurse's station, hair in a loose braid and sleeves pushed up to her elbows, when she caught the scent of something dark and roasted drifting in from the lobby. She looked up, and there he was, cleaner than she remembered, though still wearing his usual work boots, a thermos in one hand and a slightly sheepish smile on his face. I figured you might be due for something stronger than cafeteria brew, he said, holding it out like an offering. Claire took it, fingers brushing his for the briefest second. Thank you, you're not here to bleed on me again. Not today. She motioned toward the staff hallway. Come on, before someone decides you're loitering. They found a quiet corner in the break room. Jack sat across from her at the tiny table, looking slightly too large for the space. He listened more than he talked, asking questions in a way that wasn't probing but curious, about her shifts, her patience, the kind of days that wore on her. It felt strange, in a good way, to be the one answering for once. "I don't usually do this," she said after a moment. Jack glanced up. "What, talk to strange men who show up with coffee?" "No," she said, half laughing. "Let someone in, not after." She stopped, the words hung there, not heavy exactly, but unfinished. "Not after what?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then, because something in his voice made it feel safe, she told him. "Not after my fiancé died. It was 3 years ago, car accident. He was a paramedic." Jack's face shifted just barely, but enough. "I'm sorry." She nodded. "I thought I'd moved on, and maybe I have, mostly. But it's hard to let someone close when you know how easily everything can fall apart." He didn't reach for her hand or say something poetic. He just sat with her in the quiet, offering his presence like a balm. "I get that," he said. "I lost someone too, in the army. He was my co-pilot. More than that, my brother in all the ways that mattered." Their eyes met and something unspoken passed between them, recognition maybe. Of grief, of resilience, of having built lives out of the pieces that were left. After that, they saw each other when they could. He'd swing by the hospital on slower nights, or she'd drive up to the airfield after her shift. They talked about old rescues, the way the mountains looked just before a storm, the quiet panic of learning to sleep in a bed that used to belong to two. Claire found herself laughing more. There was something solid about Jack, something grounded. He didn't try to fix her sadness, but he never turned away from it either. And she, in turn, learned the subtle shifts in his voice when something weighed on him. She saw how he watched the sky like it might hold an answer he hadn't found yet. One weekend, he invited her to ride with him on a routine flight. She hesitated at first. Helicopters reminded her too much of emergency calls and trauma. But he waited, patient, until she said yes. They took off just after sunrise. From the sky, the valley looked like a quilt of greens and golds. The mountains rose like old stories at the edges of the earth. Claire sat beside him, headset snug over her ears, heart thudding a little too fast. "You okay?" Jack asked, glancing sideways. She nodded, gripping the edge of the seat. "Yeah, just trying not to imagine us crash landing." He chuckled. "I've got a solid record, Nurse Devon, trust me." And for some reason, she did. They flew in easy silence for a while, the rhythmic thrum of the rotors washing over them like wind through trees. She looked out over the ridges, the rivers threading through the land below, and felt something unfamiliar tug at her chest. Not fear, not sorrow. Possibility. When they landed, she didn't get out right away. Jack powered down the engine and sat there beside her, fingers curled loosely around the throttle. "You were amazing," she said, voice quiet under the stillness. "So were you." Claire turned to him. The morning light slanted across his face, catching the edge of the scar near his temple. She reached out without thinking and touched it, her fingers brushing gently over the healed skin. "I remember stitching this," she murmured. Jack's eyes darkened slightly. "I remember how your hands didn't shake." She smiled, something tender unfolding between them. A week later, he kissed her. It wasn't dramatic. They were sitting on the tailgate of his truck, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs, the night settling around them in soft blue shadows. He reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, and then his lips were on hers, warm, sure, a quiet question and an answer all at once. Claire didn't pull away. Afterward, they sat with their shoulders touching, not speaking for a while. There was no rush. The kind of connection growing between them didn't need to be hurried. It wasn't built on adrenaline or fleeting charm. It was steady and kind, and every part of her heart that had once gone silent was beginning to stir again. And Jack, he didn't seem afraid of the quiet. If anything, he leaned into it, like he'd been waiting for someone to share it with. Later that night, as she curled up beneath her blanket, the taste of his kiss still lingering on her lips, Claire realized something simple and strange and true. She wanted to keep choosing him. Not just on the easy days, but especially on the ones when the world hurt a little more. And maybe, just maybe, he was already choosing her too. The first time Jack spent the night at Claire's apartment, it was because a snowstorm made the roads too dangerous to drive back down the mountain. She'd just come off a brutal shift, an elderly man in cardiac arrest, a child who wouldn't stop seizing, a woman who came in whispering her pain through clenched teeth, terrified her partner would find her there. It was the kind of day that crawled under her skin and refused to let go. Jack had been waiting outside in his truck when she walked out the hospital doors, snow gathering on the hood, his breath rising in small puffs as he climbed out to meet her. "You look like you've been through a war zone," he said softly. "Feels like I have," she admitted. He reached out and smoothed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his thumb grazing her temple like it belonged there. "Let me take you home." Inside her apartment, the silence wrapped around them like a balm. Claire showered first, standing under the hot spray until her skin tingled and her shoulders finally dropped. When she came out, wearing one of his flannels over leggings, Jack had already put on a kettle and found the fuzzy socks she always kept tucked in the drawer by the couch. They didn't talk much that night, they didn't need to. He held her while she sat curled against his chest, her breathing slowly evening out. She fell asleep there, her head tucked beneath his chin, and when she woke in the early hours to the soft blue light of snow still falling, he was still holding her. In the morning they made eggs and toast. Jack burned the first round, and Claire laughed harder than she had in weeks. It became a rhythm after that. He stayed over sometimes, especially when he landed late or she came home looking like she'd given too much of herself to the day. She kept a toothbrush for him in her bathroom drawer and found herself reaching for his hand in the dark more often than not. And still, neither of them used the word love. Not yet. It was mid-March when she got the call. A small aircraft had gone down near the West Ridge, dense terrain, bad weather closing in, and no solid GPS lock. The rescue teams were thin that day, and Jack was already in the air when the request came through. Claire was on duty, but she called in her lunch break and drove to the command post anyway. She stood by the radio trailer, jacket zipped to her chin, fingers white-knuckled in her pockets. Margot came to stand beside her. "You okay?" Claire nodded, but her eyes stayed on the map. "He's out there. They'll bring them in, you know how good he is." That wasn't what Claire meant. She wasn't worried about the strangers in the crash, not yet. She was thinking about Jack in the sky, Jack threading through mountain fog and wind, chasing shadows and echoes. The radio crackled. "Command, this is Alpha 2, I've got visual, one survivor confirmed. Injuries present, returning to base, over." Claire's heart thudded. She knew his voice even through static, knew the steady calm he used when things were still uncertain. She exhaled slowly, hand bracing against the side of the trailer. When he landed, covered in snow and soot and streaks of blood that weren't his, she was waiting. He stepped out, shoulders heavy, eyes searching. She moved before she meant to, walking straight into his arms. He folded around her like he'd been waiting to exhale too. "You're here," he murmured into her hair. "Of course I am." They stood like that, unmoving, while the crews bustled and shouted around them. That night back at her place, Claire made soup. Jack sat at her kitchen table, one arm bandaged from a cut he refused to have stitched. "I brought someone back today," he said. Claire nodded. "He was dying, we got him to a hospital in time." She glanced over. "You did good." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Every time I go up I wonder what it'll cost, and every time I come back you're here. I don't know what to do with that kind of grace." Claire set the spoon down and walked over to him. She leaned against his back, arms around his shoulders. "You don't have to do anything with it," she said into his neck. "Just let it be what it is." He reached up and held her hand to his chest. She could feel the beat of his heart there, steady, strong, vulnerable in the best way. It wasn't always easy after that. They fought sometimes, small things at first, then the deeper stuff. Claire hated how he sometimes shut down after a hard rescue. Jack hated when she didn't tell him about the nights that still haunted her from work. They both carried ghosts, and sometimes those ghosts bumped shoulders in the dark. But they kept showing up. She was there when his mother got sick. He was there the night she broke down after losing a patient she'd promised would pull through. They learned how to be quiet in the right moments, how to ask questions without pressing, how to hold space for each other without needing to fix what wasn't theirs to fix. One Sunday, while driving up to a trailhead just to get some air, Jack pulled over near the overlook. The valley spread wide below them, clouds low and golden with the late afternoon sun. He cut the engine and turned to her. "I've been thinking about that night you stitched me up," he said. Claire smiled. "You mean the night you almost bled out trying to look tough?" He chuckled. "Yeah, that one." He reached into his jacket and pulled something from the inner pocket. It wasn't a ring box, it was just a folded piece of paper. She took it, brows drawn, and opened it. Inside was a simple drawing, a sketch really. Her standing by a hospital bed, gloves on, brow furrowed in concentration, and Jack sitting there with a smirk and blood drying on his temple. The caption read, where it started, "Where I knew." Claire blinked at it, her throat suddenly thick. He spoke before she could answer. I knew that night something about the way you saw me, the way you didn't look away. I've been carrying that moment with me ever since. She looked up at him, heart beating fast. Jack pulled something else from his coat then, a ring this time. Simple, silver, the kind of quiet promise that didn't need embellishment. Claire Devon, will you marry me? There was no grand display, just the two of them, hearts worn and open, the sky wide behind them. She nodded, the tears coming easily now. Yes. Then she laughed, and it shook out of her like relief. You really flew back into my life just to propose on a cliff. Jack grinned, seemed appropriate. She leaned in, kissed him slow and sure. And for the first time in years, she felt completely unafraid of what came next. They married in late September when the air had that gentle crispness that whispered of change without fully letting go of summer. The trees were beginning to turn, their edges glowing with early color, and the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and pine. Claire hadn't wanted anything extravagant, no ballrooms or endless guest lists, just something true. They chose a small meadow nestled against the base of the mountain where Jack flew search routes, the same one she'd seen from the passenger seat of his helicopter on that early morning flight. They brought folding chairs, wildflowers in mason jars, and a white canopy tied down with rope and river stones. Claire wore a simple lace dress, soft ivory that swayed around her legs when she walked. Her hair was pinned back loosely, with a few strands falling near her cheeks, and she'd fastened her grandmother's locket at her collarbone, a quiet reminder of love that lasted. Jack stood by the altar in a charcoal suit with his sleeves rolled up, because anything more formal wouldn't have felt like him. His scar peeked out beneath the edge of his neatly trimmed hair, and when Claire stepped into view, his breath caught. No one clapped, no one cheered. The whole place just seemed to still, like the earth itself was holding its breath for them. Their vows were private, written the night before, sitting back to back in their small apartment, notebooks in their laps and the quiet hum of the city below their open window. At the altar, they read them in soft voices, close enough to touch, but not quite. I promise to choose you, Jack said, voice steady even as his eyes glistened. Every time, every day, even when the sky is falling, you're the only stillness I've ever wanted to keep. Claire blinked back tears as she read hers. I promise to let you in even when it's easier to run. I promise to love you like I did that first night, quietly, without needing words, but completely. When the ceremony ended, Jack didn't kiss her like people do in movies. He leaned his forehead to hers first, breathing her in like the moment was something he wanted to memorize. Then he kissed her, slow and steady, the kind of kiss that spoke of all the ways they had come through. Afterward, they didn't have a reception. Just a campfire, some music from a Bluetooth speaker, and a handful of close friends and family laughing under string lights. Claire danced barefoot in the grass, and Jack watched her with a look that made her knees go weak every time she caught it. They didn't even cut a cake. Instead, they toasted marshmallows and passed around a thermos of spiked cider, the kind Claire's dad always made on holidays. They stayed late into the evening, until the last lantern flickered out and only the stars were left. Later that night, wrapped in blankets in a small cabin tucked in the woods near the airfield, Claire lay beside Jack with her head on his chest. The room smelled like cedar and the candle she'd packed from home, lavender and smoke. Outside, the wind picked up and rustled the branches, but inside, everything was warm. She traced lazy circles over the center of his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath her fingertips. He covered her hand with his, lacing their fingers together. You remember the night you stitched me up? He asked, his voice gravel-soft. She smiled, kind of hard to forget. I walked out of there thinking I'd never see you again, and I hated that. I hated that something so simple, so good, might just vanish. Claire tilted her head to look up at him, but you came back. He met her gaze because I couldn't not. They lay there in silence for a while, the kind that feels earned and sacred. A silence where everything had already been said. Jack kissed the top of her head and said, I didn't just fall in love with you, Claire, I landed in you. Like I'd been circling for years and finally found home. She felt her throat tighten but didn't look away. And I found someone who knows how to hold broken things without trying to fix them. That means everything. The next morning, they woke early and climbed into his helicopter, just the two of them. Claire had never imagined a honeymoon in the sky, but with Jack at the controls and the sunrise breaking through the clouds in ribbons of gold and rose, she couldn't imagine anything better. He flew them low over the valley where they'd first kissed, then circled the clearing near Angel's Point where they'd found the lost hiker. Every place held a memory now, stitched into the landscape like part of a story only they knew how to read. They landed near a hidden lake he'd once found during a rescue mission and laid out a blanket near the water. Claire pulled off her boots and let the cold seep into her toes. Jack pulled out 2 mugs and poured hot coffee from a thermos, handing her one with a smile. "You really don't do anything halfway, do you?" she teased. "Nope," he said, clinking his mug to hers. "Especially not love." They sat in the silence again, shoulder to shoulder, watching the water catch the sky. Claire leaned into him, her heart full in a way she'd never known before. Not flashy, not overwhelming, just full, like something had finally clicked into place after years of quiet longing. She thought back to all the moments that had led them here, the first aid room, the stitches, the snowstorm, the morning flights. None of it had looked like a love story from the outside. It hadn't been fast or easy or built on sweeping declarations. It had been stitched together gently, like skin drawn close after a wound, thread by thread. Love had come not in the form of promises made too soon, but in showing up late after long shifts. In burnt toast, in steady hands, in the way he waited for her to be ready, in a helicopter ride and a proposal spoken with quiet awe. Claire looked at Jack, the man who'd stumbled into her life bleeding and unguarded, and realized she hadn't just fallen in love with him. She had chosen him. And she would keep choosing him, on the good days, on the hard ones, in the quiet, in the storm. Always.